So the violent crime issue is one of the most important problems facing Chicago and really almost every other major city in America. Violent crime is also extremely regressive in its impact, being concentrated in the most economically and racially segregated communities.
Homicide is by far the leading cause of death for Black males aged 15 to 24, responsible for more deaths than the next 9 leading causes of death combined. And all youth in the United States are at much greater risk than their counterparts in other high-income countries. But that risk is not evenly distributed. Here, we look at a collection of 17 high-income countries, the gun homicide rate for males aged 15 to 24 compared to white males, Latino males, and Black youth in the United States. You can see the disparities are striking and heartbreaking, and we need to address these problems with greater urgency. This is also a problem that's been incredibly difficult to solve. Here, we're looking at the incredible progress we've made addressing a couple of the other leading causes of mortality over the past 50 years. Things like infant mortality, heart disease, and strokes. While we've made great progress over time on those issues, the homicide rate today is about what it was in 1950 and even 1900.
We set up the crime lab with the belief that at least part of the problem in this area is we haven't been serious enough about using data and evidence to make progress. There's no shortage of innovation in this area, right? People, mayors, nonprofit organizations are trying new things all the time. There's new ideas, there's new programming. So there's no shortage of innovation, but what there is shortage of is empirical evidence about what works, for whom, and why. So the crime lab was set up to use the insights from basic science to help city agencies and nonprofit organizations design, rigorously test, and then scale innovative approaches at reducing crime and violence. But enough about us.
Sometimes big social problems persist because they're really hard to solve. But other times we think they persist because we've been focused on doing the wrong things. So what we want to suggest in our talk today is the possibility that we might be able to make a lot of progress on the problems of crime and violence simply by helping people to stop, look, and listen before they act. So we think that a lot of this problem is driven by the type of automatic behavior we all experience every day in the ways that we interact with people in our community. This flies in the face of what we think about as the problems of crime, where we see things like economic poverty driving a lot of the issue.
So some people look at economic poverty as one of the main drivers in crime, and the theory is that people are desperately trying to make ends meet, and so it might make sense to engage in crime if you have very few opportunities in the formal labor market. This is an explanation you hear from a lot of people who think of crime really as a rational behavior that comes out of some consideration of the relative benefits and costs from engaging in that act.
Another sort of explanation is moral poverty, or the inadequate development of some sort of moral sense. And this was most famously articulated in the 1990s when folks warned about a coming age of super predators. The problem that we see with both of these explanations is that they imply that criminals are deeply committed to engaging in crime and will therefore be very hard to steer in a different direction.
This is the sort of impression you might get from watching shows like The Wire, where you have characters like Snoop Pearson who are taking out hits on their rivals. And what's happening or what's portrayed in the show is that there are people who are systematically murdering people for money or turf or drugs. But we'd like to offer a different view of what the crime problem looks like. This is an event that took place about 10 miles from where you are sitting right now, and although it happened in Chicago, it's actually representative of what many of the violent acts look like across the United States. So on June 2nd, 2012, in the South Shore neighborhood of Chicago, at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, there were two groups of teens arguing about whether someone in one group had stolen a bike from someone in the other group. As the two groups finally started to separate, someone pulled a handgun out of their waistband, fired into the opposing crowd, and struck Jamal Lockett in the chest. Jamal, only age 16, was rushed via ambulance up Lakeshore Drive to Northwestern University Hospital, where he was later pronounced dead. 2 weeks later, the shooter, Kelvin Carter, age 17, was accused of first-degree murder and later prosecuted by the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, essentially ending 2 lives.
Unfortunately, this type of incident is not at all uncommon in Chicago, and police data tell us that about 3/4 of all homicides stem from this type of altercation. An argument over basically nothing that spirals out of control and ends in a tragedy. So with that in mind, we want to suggest a different view of why people might engage in crime.
And to help you get a better sense of this view, I know it's early, we're the first ones up, we're gonna ask you to indulge us in a little bit of an audience participation game. And so we need you to loosen up a little bit, get the voices ready, and what's gonna happen is Julia's gonna click to the next slide and you're gonna see an object in the middle of the screen. So what I want you to do is enthusiastically and quickly yell out the color of the slide that you see. Ready? Okay, so we said quickly, and we need everyone to participate. Unless everyone does it, this is going to flop, and then it's going to be a really awkward part of the talk. So we're going to try it again. We need everyone to do it, and do it quickly and loudly. Ready?
Black.
Almost. We're still a little delayed. It's a little quicker. Last time. Ready?
Black.
All right, there we go. So now you're going to see a succession of slides, and again, just like the black one, you're going to yell out the color you see as soon as you see it. Ready?
Black, red, green, yellow, blue.
So why did we just do that? Part of the reason was to test the reading level of the Latin community, but you guys seem to be doing okay on that. The real reason is to suggest, again, this idea of automatic behavior. We all respond automatically to our environment all the time, and often that serves us well. This is what psychologists call System 1 thinking, and it stands in contrast to System 2 thinking, which is much more effortful and deliberative. But because System 2 thinking is mentally costly, it's adaptive for us to outsource a lot of our everyday behavior to our automatic systems. And this idea of System 1 and System 2 is brilliantly laid out in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So we think that a lot of the automatic behavior that we engage in every day serves us very well, but in this instance, it was maladaptive, and you responded automatically before stopping to think about what you were doing. This type of thing can cause huge problems in neighborhoods in Chicago and elsewhere when there's great variability in the type of response that is adaptive. So while we all behave automatically, our hypothesis is that the costs of behaving automatically are far higher for youth growing up in very challenging circumstances.
For example, you've developed an automatic behavior that when you see a word, you read it. If you didn't have that automatic behavior, it would take forever to get through a book or a paper. It would just take us forever to do anything. But maybe the instance that I mentioned earlier with Calvin Carter, maybe he's developed an automatic response that says, I can't let people think I'm a pushover, or when I'm out in the streets in my neighborhood, I need to put up a tough front, which certainly seems adaptive in a lot of neighborhoods in which developing a reputation for being tough can be very protective against future victimization.
So we've started to accumulate some evidence here in Chicago that supports this idea of automatic behavior and its importance for crime. We held a design competition, kind of trying to crowdsource good ideas from the community about what might work to reduce youth violence. And the winner of that competition, this was back in 2009, was the Becoming a Man program, or B.A.M, which was developed and is implemented still to this day by Chicago nonprofit Youth Guidance. It's a counseling and mentoring group-based program in schools that's inspired by the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy, which tries to get people to slow down, behave less automatically, and think about their thinking.
To evaluate the program, we conducted a randomized control trial similar to the evaluations that you see in medicine, but unfortunately still remain far too rare in the area of public policy. So what we did was have the program provide counseling sessions once a week during the school day as part of the youth's experience in their local high school. The students who participated in the study, on average, had failed 2.5 classes the year before, and at the start of the study, 35% of them had already been arrested.
So what happens when you give this type of relatively light touch, relatively inexpensive program to kids in some of Chicago's toughest high schools for a year? The answer is it increases their school engagement. So kids were coming to school more, they were failing fewer classes, and these impacts we think will translate into increases in high school graduation of between 10 and 20%. It also reduces the rate at which they're being arrested for serious violent offenses by 44%. When you think about how socially and economically costly violent crime is, you can get a sense for the magnitude of these impacts.
And we were extremely encouraged by those initial results. But there's the perception out there that you can really do anything one time at moderate scale with one study. So the real question becomes, can you replicate these findings? Can you show them again with different counselors, different kids, different schools, and different contexts? So what we did was conduct a second randomized control trial in 2013-2014, this time with just over 2,000 males in 9th and 10th grade across 9 CPS high schools. And at the end of the study, we again see an increase in school engagement. So again, kids are coming to school a lot more. They're failing fewer classes. And this time we see a reduction in overall arrests by 31%, which is equal to about 18 fewer arrests per 100 youth who are in the study.
So we also decided to up the ante and try out the same type of cognitive behavioral therapy approach, this time at much lower cost and with kids who are kind of at the highest risk for serious violent crime. Those kids who are held and detained in the Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center pre-trial. The JTDC is the largest facility of its kind in the country, but due to litigation a couple years ago, there was an extended period of time where half of the facility was implementing cognitive behavioral therapy during the day with kids, and half of the facility maintained kind of the status quo operations. So kids entering the facility were randomly assigned to units, creating the perfect conditions for a natural experiment. So we worked with the folks at the JTDC to study this program, and this time we instead of having trained providers and a nonprofit deliver this intervention, it was delivered by detention center guards. And what did we see? We find that the program reduced the rates of return to the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center by 21%. So kids were getting out and they were staying out.
So clearly these two programs work. And then the next logical question is, are these type of interventions worth the investment? And I think this is a particularly important question to policymakers, given the kind of financial situation in our state with CPS. It's really important for policymakers to understand what programs and what policies generate the most social good per dollar spent.
So we've started to think a lot about this, and when you monetize the academic and behavioral benefits of these types of interventions, they seem to far outweigh the costs on the order of 70 to 1, up to that. So that's enormous, and it's driven mainly by projected increases in high school graduation and all of the kind of positive long-term life outcomes that result from that, and also by these incredible reductions in violent crime.
Now, if you think about that, it's kind of like having a machine in which you would put $1 in and then get $70 back, which is really incredible and just something you don't see in the area of public policy. Those like benefit cost ratios just do not exist usually. And so I think one of the things that you have to keep in mind when thinking about the program is really think about what they don't do. So they don't change the economic poverty, and they don't change moral poverty, and they don't change discrimination or lousy schools, or really the larger social context that any of these young men are growing up in. And I think it's really important to point out that all those things are super important to deal with, and they need our attention, and they need to be tackled. But to make any real progress is going to take a lot of time and a massive amount of resources. And these kids are still growing up in these environments right now, and so they need the tools and the resources to be successful in their lives today. They can't wait for that kind of long-term outcome. And so I think what you have to think about with the programs, what they do is you see two very different interventions delivered by very different groups in different ways still produce really positive outcomes for kids. And so I think the really promising concept behind all this is that the underlying program logic of getting kids to stop, look, and listen could be what's driving the impact and not any one scarce ingredient that might be hard to find.
And we do have some preliminary evidence on mechanisms that suggests that the program is doing just that. So we carried out some lab experiments with kids who were in the study and found that B.A.M actually does get kids to slow down and physically take more time before responding to situations. So it's incredibly encouraging, we think, and has really changed our view about what drives a lot of the violence on the streets of Chicago. And I think it was captured really nicely by something that one of the staff members at the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center said to our research team while we were doing this study.
He said, 20% of our residents are just criminals. They need to be locked up. But the other 80%, I always tell them, if I could give you back just 10 minutes of your lives, most of you would not be here.
By getting kids to slow down and behave less automatically, these interventions that we've talked about are doing just that. They're getting kids to respond differently in these really critical 10-minute periods. And we think that these programs and lots of others like them could be a promising part of the solution. So the bad news is that we may have tragically misdiagnosed a big part of the crime problem in this country and perhaps needlessly put millions of people behind bars. I think the good news is that we're starting to identify programs that can make a big difference, that are less costly and far more humane.
It's not too late to help kids who are growing up in extremely challenging environments, even when they reach adolescence. But we just need to understand what the underlying problems really are and then deliver interventions that are aimed at the right targets.
Thank you.